Okay, let's unpack this whole thing. I mean, we've all been there, haven't we? You look in the mirror, maybe struggling with, the button on your favorite jeans and just think, "Oh, this belly fat."
Right. It's a common frustration.
And we try things, right? Diets, crunches, maybe some gadget we saw online. We focus so much on how it looks, but the material you shared, it makes it really, really clear there's a much bigger reason, a health reason, to care about this specific fat.
That's absolutely right. The science, it really points to abdominal fat, especially the stuff deep inside, being a pretty significant health risk, sometimes even more than just your overall weight.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're digging into what the research, what the health experts are actually saying about losing belly fat. We're focusing specifically on those health implications and the strategies that are actually backed by science.
Hmm.
We've got a bunch of sources here, research papers, health info from reputable places. And this deep dive, it's really for you listening to help you sort of cut through the noise and grasp what's truly important here.
Yeah, and to start, I think it's really crucial to understand that not all body fat is created equal. The research makes a clear distinction.
Right, like there's the fat you can actually pinch, subcutaneous fat.
Exactly. That's the layer just under the skin. It's softer, and for most people, it's about 90% of their total body fat.
Okay, so that's most of it, but then there's the other kind.
Yes, the visceral fat,
Well,
or sometimes it's called intra-abdominal fat, and that's the one that's way more concerning from a health standpoint. It's hidden, like deep inside your abdomen. It wraps around your organs, the liver, intestines. It's even in that fatty apron called the omentum.
only about 10% of total fat, you said, but it's the troublemaker.
It's a key player, yeah. A disproportionate player in health problems.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit concerning. Why is this deep visceral fat so much more dangerous?
Well, it's because it's not just inert padding. It's actually biologically active. Research shows it acts almost like its own organ, an endocrine organ. It secretes hormones, various molecules, and these have effects all over the body.
Right, I think I remember reading somewhere that, like, historically, people thought it just messed with cholesterol because it released fatty acids to the liver or something.
That was part of the understanding, yeah. But we now know it's much more complex. This visceral fat produces things called cytokines.
Cytokines, okay.
And these cytokines can trigger this kind of low-level chronic inflammation throughout your body, which we know is a risk factor for loads of chronic diseases. Plus, it makes a precursor to something called angiotensin.
Angiotensin, that
Eh,
sounds familiar. Blood pressure.
Exactly. It causes blood vessels to constrict, tighten up, which then raises blood pressure. Subcutaneous fat, on the other hand, seems to produce more molecules that are actually beneficial. It's a very different profile.
Wow. Okay. So, having too much of this visceral fat, even if your BMI isn't technically in the overweight category, it's linked to some really serious health risks.
Yeah.
Let's list some of those out based on the sources.
Absolutely. Heart disease is a huge one. The link is very clear in the research. There was one analysis of European women aged 45 to 79. It found those with the largest waists had more than double the risk of developing heart disease.
Double. Wow.
Yeah, even after adjusting for other factors, it was still nearly double. And another piece highlighted that for healthy, non-smoking women, every extra 2 inches in waist size upped their cardiovascular disease risk by about 10%.
10% for just 2 inches.
It adds up. And visceral fat is strongly tied to metabolic syndrome.
Right, that cluster of things.
Yeah, higher blood pressure, high blood sugar, high triglycerides, and low levels of the good HDL cholesterol. All major risks for heart disease and type 2 diabetes.
And the risks don't stop there, do they? The research mentioned cancer, too.
It did. There's an increased risk for certain types, like breast cancer, in premenopausal women with abdominal obesity. And some studies suggest maybe a 3 times higher risk of colorectal adenomas. Those are like precancerous polyps, probably because of the link with insulin resistance.
That's significant. And then dementia. That one really caught my eye.
It's surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, research like a big Kaiser Permanente study found that having high levels of abdominal fat in your early 40s was linked to almost triple the risk of dementia, including Alzheimer's later on.
Triple the risk.
And interestingly, fat stored in the thighs didn't show that same link. It really points to the location mattering.
And even asthma, how does that connect?
Correct. There was a study, I think, on California teachers that found women with high visceral fat were about 37% more likely to develop asthma. The thinking is it's likely due to that inflammatory effect we talk about. The visceral fat promotes inflammation systemically, and that can affect the airways too.
Okay, so this stuff is clearly not good. How can you, sitting at home, figure out if you have too much of this risky visceral fat without getting a fancy scan?
Yeah, the best simple at-home method discussed in the material is just using a tape measure around your waist.
Okay, where exactly?
Good question. You should measure at the level of your belly button.
Mm.
Or some guidelines say level with the top of your right hip bone. Find that spot and measure there. The key is consistency.
Do it the same way each time.
Exactly. And don't suck in your stomach and don't pull the tape super tight, just snug.
And are there, like, threshold numbers we should be aware of?
Generally, yeah. The guidelines often point to over 35 inches for women and over 40 inches for men, as indicating increased health risk from visceral fat. But honestly, maybe even more important than a single number is noticing changes. If your waist measurement is creeping up, if your pants are getting tighter, that's a good sign you might be accumulating visceral fat.
Okay, that makes sense. Focus on the trend. So we know why it's bad. What can we actually do about it? The sources give some practical strategies.
They definitely do. And there's good news here too. The research highlights that visceral fat is actually more metabolically active, which means it tends to respond better to diet and exercise compared to that subcutaneous fat on your hips and thighs. It breaks down more readily.
Oh, that is good news. Okay, let's walk through some of those tips, like the ones from the Johns Hopkins material. The first one was interesting. Focus on curbing carbs more than fats.
Yes, that refers to studies like one from Johns Hopkins. They compared a low-carb diet and a low-fat diet, keeping the calories the same for both groups over 6 months. The results were pretty striking. The low-carb group lost significantly more weight, average of almost 29 pounds, versus about 19 pounds for the low-fat group.
Wow, that's a big difference.
And, importantly, the quality of the weight loss seemed better. They lost a higher percentage of fat compared to lean muscle mass.
So it's not just calories in, calories out. The type of calorie seems to matter for this?
It suggests that, yeah, a low-carb approach doesn't have to mean no carbs, but it's about shifting away from, refined carbs, sugary drinks, white bread, bagels, that kind of stuff, and moving towards foods higher in fiber and protein, vegetables, beans, lean meats, healthy fats.
Makes sense. Another point they stressed was thinking eating plan, not diet.
Oh, absolutely. This is all about sustainability. You need an approach you can actually live with long term. It's about a healthy lifestyle, not just a temporary fix to drop weight quickly.
And then the obvious one, keep moving. Physical activity helps burn abdominal fat. How does that work exactly?
Well, the research points to a couple things. Exercise helps lower your circulating insulin levels.
And insulin tells the body to store fat, right?
Right. So less insulin means less signal to store fat. Plus, exercise makes your liver use up fatty acids, especially those floating around from nearby visceral fat deposits.
Okay. How much exercise are we talking?
The general recommendation is usually around 30 to 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise on most days of the week.
Got it. And lifting weights, strength training, that's also important.
Very important.
And
Building lean muscle mass is key because muscle burns more calories than fat, even when you're just sitting around. So it boosts your overall metabolism 24/7, which really helps in tackling fat, including visceral fat. It improves your body composition.
The sources also mentioned becoming a label reader. Sounds basic, but probably important.
It really is. Just taking a moment to compare products, different yogurts, sauces, dressings, you'd be surprised how much hidden sugar and unhealthy fats can be lurking in processed foods.
Which leads right into the next tip. Steer clear of processed foods as much as possible.
Yeah, they're often packed with trans fats, tons of added sugar, loads of salt, all things that make losing weight, especially that stubborn belly fat, much harder. Stick to whole, real foods when you can.
And here's one I liked. Focus more on how your clothes fit than the number on the scale.
Yes, this is so true, especially if you're adding strength training. Muscle is denser than fat, right? So you could be losing inches off your waist, losing fat and gaining muscle, but the scale might not budge much or could even go up slightly. Your clothes getting looser is a fantastic sign of progress.
It's a better indicator of losing the right kind of weight. And remember those waist targets. Under 35 inches for women, under 40 for men for reducing health risks.
Exactly.
And finally, kind of a social tip, hang out with health-focused friends.
Huh. Yeah, the research actually backed this up. Studies show that your social network influences your habits. If your friends are eating well and exercising, you're more likely to do it too. It creates a supportive environment.
Makes sense. It was also interesting that some of the analysis, I think from Johns Hopkins again, found that just losing weight, especially the belly fat and exercising, improved how well people's arteries functioned.
Mm.
And that happened even if they didn't drastically cut all the fat from their diet.
Right. It reinforces that targeting this specific visceral fat has direct benefits for your cardiovascular health, kind of independent of just overall weight loss or total dietary fat intake.
Okay, so those are the general strategies. Really helpful. Now, let's maybe dive a bit deeper into the exercise science part, particularly this whole idea of spot reduction. Can you really target fat loss?
Right. So the research review acknowledges something important first. Exercise alone might not always lead to huge drops on the bathroom scale. Fat is very energy dense. But critically, exercise consistently improves body composition. It helps you lose fat, gain muscle, and it boosts your metabolic health. Things like insulin sensitivity, overall fitness, even if your total weight doesn't change much.
Okay, that's a key distinction. Body composition over just weight. Now, within exercise, there are different types, different intensities.
Yeah, the research breaks it down. You have moderate intensity, continuous training, or MICT.
Mm.
Thing like a steady jog or bike ride. During that kind of exercise, fat is often the main fuel source being burned.
Okay, fat burning during the workout.
Then you have high-intensity interval training, HII, or sprint interval training, SIT. These are those short, really intense bursts of effort followed by rest. During those super high-intensity bursts, your body primarily uses carbohydrates for fuel, not fat.
Ah, okay, so less fat burn during HIIT.
During the actual high-intensity intervals, yes. But here's the interesting finding from the review. Despite burning less fat during the session itself, HIIT and SIT can be just as effective, maybe even sometimes more, for reducing total body fat and specifically visceral fat compared to the longer, moderate intensity workouts.
How does that work then?
Well, their overall effectiveness for reducing visceral fat and improving things like fasting glucose and HbA1c seems comparable to MICT. And they're often much more time efficient, which is a big plus for many people.
Okay, time efficiency is huge. Now, this brings us right back to that classic question, spot reduction. Can you do exercises for one area, like your abs, and burn fat specifically from that area?
The conventional wisdom, and what many sources like Harvard reiterate, has generally been no. Doing endless crunches will strengthen your ab muscles, which is great, but it won't preferentially melt the layer of fat sitting on top of those muscles
Yes.
or the deeper visceral fat in that region. Fat loss is usually seen as more systemic.
That's what I've always heard. But there was one study in the materials, a randomized controlled trial, that seemed to challenge that.
It did. It's quite interesting. This specific study took overweight men and had one group do aerobic endurance training, specifically targeting the abdomen, while another group did general treadmill running. They carefully matched the total energy burned in both groups over 10 weeks.
Okay, matched energy burn. What did they find?
Their conclusion was pretty direct. They stated that the study advocates that spot reduction exists in overweight adult males.
Whoa. Okay, advocates for spot reduction. How?
Specifically, they found that the group doing the abdominal aerobic endurance training showed evidence of utilizing more fat from the trunk area compared to the group doing the whole body treadmill exercise.
Okay, hold on. So it wasn't sit-ups or crunches, which are muscle building. It was aerobic endurance exercise, but focused on the abs.
That seems to be the crucial difference in this particular study's findings. It wasn't about strength exercises for the abs. It was aerobic work targeting that area.
That's a really interesting nuance. It suggests maybe the type of exercise focused on an area could matter for localized fat use.
It opens up that possibility, yeah. Perhaps through mechanisms that go beyond just the calories burned during the workout itself.
So let's talk about those other mechanisms. How might exercise, especially that high-intensity stuff where you're burning carbs during, still lead to fat loss, particularly visceral fat loss?
Good question. One well-known factor is epitosa excess post-exercise oxygen consumption.
The afterburn effect.
Exactly. After a strenuous workout, your metabolism stays elevated for a while as your body recovers, repairs tissues, replenishes energy stores, and the energy for that ongoing process can come partly from breaking down fat.
So you continue burning extra calories, potentially fat calories, even after you've stopped exercising.
Precisely. Another potential mechanism is that exercise might improve how your fat tissue actually functions. It could enhance the ability of your fat cells to store and release fat appropriately and improve your body's overall metabolic flexibility.
Metabolic flexibility, meaning,
Basically, how easily your body can switch between burning carbohydrates and burning fat for fuel, depending on what you're doing and what's available. Exercise seems to improve that adaptability.
Okay. And there was something mentioned about crosstalk between muscles and fat.
Yes, muscle adipose tissue crosstalk. When your muscles contract during exercise, they release various signaling molecules, sometimes called myokines. One example mentioned is IL-6, interleukin 6. And the review suggests that IL-6 might actually promote lipolysis, that's fat breakdown throughout the body, potentially contributing to visceral fat reduction.
So the muscles are kind of talking to the fat tissue.
In a way, yes. There was even a study noted where blocking the action of IL-6 seemed to prevent exercise from reducing visceral fat, suggesting it plays a real role.
That's fascinating. It really shows how interconnected everything is.
It really does. And one more key finding from a meta-analysis discussed in the review. When it comes to reducing visceral fat specifically, exercise intensity appeared to be more important than the total duration of the exercise session.
Intensity trumps duration for visceral fat. That's a big takeaway.
It seems so. It helps explain why HIT day and SET, even though they're shorter, can be so effective for targeting that dangerous deep belly fat. It's not just about logging hours, the effort level matters.
Okay, so let's tie all this incredible information back to you, the listener. The core message running through all these sources is crystal clear, isn't it? Focusing on reduce, like that abdominal, that visceral fat, it's really not just about aesthetics, about how you look.
Not at all. It's fundamentally about improving your metabolic health and seriously lowering your risk for some major diseases. Heart disease, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, dementia, even asthma. It's about long-term health.
And while, yeah, genetics, age, hormones, they all play a part in where your body tends to store fat, the research powerfully confirms that you can take meaningful action. It's not out of your control.
Absolutely. Making conscious choices about your diet is huge. Focusing on whole, unprocessed foods, really cutting back on those refined carbs and added sugars we talked about. That's foundational.
And getting regular exercise is just non-negotiable, right? A mix of aerobic activity and strength training.
Yes. And maybe keeping in mind that finding an intensity level that challenges you could be particularly beneficial for tackling that deep visceral fat based on what the meta-analysis suggests.
And remembering, crucially, that progress isn't just that number on the scale.
So important. Pay attention to how your clothes fit, measure your waistline periodically. Those changes are real, tangible signs that you're losing the fat that matters most for health and likely gaining beneficial muscle.
These aren't overnight fixes, obviously.
No, it's about building sustainable, healthy habits based on these scientific insights we've dug into.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something provocative to leave you thinking about. Consider that really interesting tension we found in the sources. On one hand, you have the widely accepted principle. You can't really spot reduce fat with exercise like crunches.
Right, the general rule.
But then you have that specific randomized controlled trial suggesting that localized aerobic endurance training, not strength training, but aerobic work focused on the abdomen, actually did seem to increase fat utilization from the trunk area more than general cardio.
Yeah, that study definitely throws a bit of a curveball into the conventional thinking.
It really does. It just reminds us that the science around our bodies is complex, it's always evolving, and we're constantly learning new things, sometimes things that challenge what we thought we knew.
Absolutely, it keeps things interesting.
So the question for you to ponder is, what does that specific study make you think about the different types of exercise you might do? Could targeted aerobic work have effects we haven't fully appreciated? It certainly leaves us with an intriguing question about exercise and its potentially localized effects on fat.